Hey guys, welcome to book review 106, I believe. Today I will be reviewing The Great Wall, The Extraordinary Story of China's Wonder of the World by John Mann. Well, to start out, this is really a great book. It kind of really combines the things that I like, history, kind of travel, culture, just kind of into this milieu of interest of things that just kind of make you keep turning the pages, at least to me. Well, as the title suggests, this book is about the Great Wall of China, kind of its history, kind of the misperceptions of the Great Wall of China, and kind of how it came to um, be in its present form, or the way that it's viewed among the larger populace, both Chinese, the Chinese nation, as well as the world, um, as well as just sort of kind of a lot of different perspectives that you don't necessarily get on the brochure version of Chinese history, or not Chinese history, but like Chinese travel, stuff like that. Well, to start with, the book starts kind of on a historical basis. The first emperor that combined all of China, known for being very ruthless, that actually Mao Zedong took inspiration for a lot of his ruthlessness later on in history, was the Emperor Qin. Now, he only, his dynasty, quote unquote, only ruled for, I think it was like 70 or 80 years, and he was the emperor during most of it, at which point the empire collapsed a few decades after his death, to be reformed in the Song, or no, it's not the Song, but a later dynasty. But in any case, in addition to unifying China, he also created the first walls. Now, something about Chinese civilization geographically that you need to know, particularly early Chinese civilization, is kind of the coalescing of China as the nation that we know today happened more in north central China, basically in the Yellow River, not delta, but the Yellow River basin, if you will, with the city of Xi'an, which was the first major capital, as well as some of the later capitals, kind of coalescing in what would eventually become the modern capital in Beijing, which is, again, in North China, a little bit further to the east. But what all these have in common is that they're all on borderland with the Mongols. Well, now Mongolia. I wanted to say the barbarians. That's the word I'm looking for. And so, like, these barbarian people were just constantly viewed almost as like non-humans, as sort of an alien race to the celestial kingdom of China. The emperor, because China was, because East Asia was largely not like Europe, where there were a number of countries that had equal power. There really wasn't a balance of power to the Chinese emperor. So he really was considered, kind of through middle history, early in middle history, basically from when the country was unified in 220 BC, all the way up until really the kind of age of exploration west broke down the trade barriers and really kind of embarrassed the Chinese to a degree in the 1800s. Through all that time, the emperor, there was no challenger. Really, it was a series of, well, there wasn't any challenger externally. Well, that's not even true either. But there wasn't another large country that was on equal civilization footing, if you want to call it that, to China. And so, therefore, the emperor had a very grand perspective of himself. Now, what were these problems that I mentioned that were the challengers that at points in time in history actually usurped and came into power in China? Well, if you look at the geography of China, obviously the east coast is the ocean. The south is the Himalayas. or the range of the Himalayas for the most part. And then it kind of the Himalayas in the southwest too. And then in the west, it is the Taliban Desert and what is today modern the Uyghur Autonomous Republic, which is just barren wasteland. But it's really to the north where there was some sort of ability for a group of people to give problems to China, and that's essentially why the Great Wall was formed. Now, unlike sort of popular opinion, the Mongols, and really it was a series of peoples. One that were the Han, whose name I'm not going to remember because it's in the book and I don't remember it. But the Mongols were sort of like the pinnacle of that. Were sort of like when everything coalesced in a nation to the north that maybe did not have the grand civilization of China, but was able to actually coalesce their power and challenge China, at least on the military front. But ironically enough, a lot of this quote-unquote aggression from the north was not driven by these quote-unquote barbarians, but was really driven by kind of a policy of Chinese exclusion, of a policy of Chinese superiority. Well, how is this? Are the countries in the north attacking China? Are they attacking the great civilization? Well, it actually mentioned in the book that the last resort is often attacking for these tribes and bands or whatever. What they really want is they want to live kind of a peaceful nomadic life, which Chinese don't understand. They like living in one spot and growing rice for the most part. I mean, that's kind of a stereotype, but it's true for the most part. I mean, if you just look at the history of their country. But these nomads, largely what they wanted out of China was you can get a lot of what you need out of a nomadic lifestyle. Transportation with horses. You can get meat and milk and, shelter by the hides and stuff like that to make yurts. But there were additional items that just were not being able to be provided to the north, particularly items that weren't necessarily luxury items, but were items that made people's lives better. Say something like a cooking pot. A nomad, I think for the most part, you're not dealing in like advanced cutlery. Or another thing was like, I don't think sheep was ever really a large domesticated animal by these nomadic tribes. So a lot of times they would have like pelts and furs, but they wouldn't have any other additional clothing. So clothing was often traded. And really what it was whenever the Chinese wanted to cut off those ties because of jingoism, because they don't understand these Mongolian tribes, they would cut them off, and that's when the raids would start. In addition, the Chinese also had a policy of slowly pushing the boundary of what they saw as civilization forward. Now, this wasn't so much, this was sort of kind of a combination of military and civilian, if you will. So what it often was Chinese peasants that were kind of pushed to the edge of farming or whatever it was in their region would settle a little bit further north, just a few miles. And then obviously they felt that they needed to be defended, and then that would happen again, and they'd slowly get pushed out and out and out. These are the less successful farmers. Obviously the most successful would be hugely rich, if you will. But even then, the Chinese saw these people that were kind of peasant farmers on the edge of their civilization as Chinese, and these nomads as not. And so they needed to be defended, and the lines were continually pushed, at which case there'd be conflict, obviously, moving into what is now Inner Mongolia. And actually that policy solidified in modern China to the point where in what is called Inner Mongolia now, even though historically it's been a Mongolian region and huge nomadic region, is almost devoid of Mongols, of the national Mongol people, to the point where really the line between Mongolia, Outer Mongolia, and the nation of Mongolia really is the line between the Chinese people and the Mongol people, even though it's 200 miles north of what was often considered the border, which was the Great Wall of China. And I say border, that brings up an interesting point. In addition to kind of this jingoistic protectionist policy that led to reactionary raids against people that were largely traders, throughout history, it's not mentioned as the Great Wall of China. It's often mentioned as a border post or border wall or a long wall. That's actually the literal translation of the Chinese name of the Great Wall of China is the Long Wall, not the Great Wall of China. That's used later just as a publicity purpose to call it the Great Wall. Yeah, and often, it's not one, this is a very important point, it's not one continuous wall, but kind of was a series of walls that were cobbled together and then unified over time, specifically with the Ming, in order to fight kind of local border wars, not this larger border war. Now, I mentioned that the Ming kind of saw that as a unified border war, but that was in the 1500s, long after a lot of these walls had already been built. And so they kind of did that, if you will. Other points, I guess that's kind of the history of the wall. Really, the geography of the wall is split into 4 points. I would just want to emphasize one more time kind of something that was mentioned again and again in the book, is the non-one long wall. That is a misperception. That is not true. It's a series of walls. Sometimes they break, though, again, the Ming really kind of made it continuous or a continuous series of walls. The walls often augment what are fortresses or sort of gates or checkpoints. So it's not just merely a wall, it's a wall in augmentation to kind of these fortresses that would guard passes or, key points throughout. Yeah, but the geography of the wall, to me, it's really split kind of into, I'm going to say like 3 areas of the wall itself. And then I mentioned that the wall was often used as a border. The 4th region is actually north of where what we consider the wall is, but is, I'll start with that, is in parts of Mongolia, in northern outer Mongolia, which is of course part of China. And what that is it's essentially just a mound that I want to say the Ming, or at some point when the Mongols or the northern tribes were weak and China was able to push out, they established this thing that really wouldn't stop a horse and buggy, but was just meant as a demarcation point of, hey, this is our territory, this is your territory. And that's actually one of the policies that was used by China. The wall was eventually the most sort of interdrawn, but these Mongol people, what they would often do is they would have these raids after they're irritated because the Chinese wouldn't trade with them. They would have these raids and then move back further into their territory because they didn't engage in sort of a consistent warfare because they just lose. They didn't have the numbers. They didn't have the ability to just go mano a mano against China. So one of the policies China used was to raid into the north, once again establishing this border point, or this sort of mound, this extended 1,000-kilometer mound that says, this is our territory, this is your territory. Well, the problem with fighting nomads in Mongolia is like trying to find a needle in a haystack. You have this big, massive army that has a huge supply chain, hundreds, if not thousands of soldiers, just kind of a slow moving. And then you have these nomadic people that it's not like, 99% of Mongolian territory is just uninhabited. So you're just kind of like I said, looking for a needle in a haystack. So good luck finding them. So that policy didn't work. The wall, just in general, the wall policy didn't work. Really, as I mentioned, what worked the best was trading, but that would be beneath the Chinese because they didn't deal with inferior people. And often it was quoted put in the context of not trading, but, oh, we are being generous to you by offering you these products, and you are our vassals, so you are giving us taxation by doing this. It essentially was trade, but, you know, the Chinese, they got to have their, you know, feet kissed, if you will, or, you know, no-towed to, whatever that word is. Okay, so that's the Northern Territory. I'm kind of rambling a little bit, kind of going around different directions. The three other territories, I'll start with the Far West. The Far West was an interesting spot for both the Mongols and the Chinese because the Mongols had trouble outside of Genghis Khan, which I'll get to, this is going to be a long review, of really taking over large territory because, again, they're raiders. They're not able to hold, they're just able to raid. And so, essentially, they couldn't make a direct attack on Beijing or direct attack on cities further to the south and hold them because there would just be more reinforcements of wave after wave of Chinese coming to the north. But what they could do along what would become famously the Silk Road, and the Silk Road kind of starts where the wall ends, or there's a little bit of interlap, but it's the western part of the wall and the eastern part of the Silk Road. And around these areas, what you would have is, and this is the area I'm talking about, kind of where they interlap, you would have these cities that would kind of be cut off from the rest of civilization by the fact that they were oasis towns. They were out in the desert. So they were true cities. They were trading posts. They had the goods that the northern tribes were looking for, but did not have the reinforcements from the south. So, and of course, once the Mongols can get this territory, first of all, the Chinese consider it their territory, so they're going to be angry about that. But once they do kind of control these sort of oasis towns, they can strengthen their position by having greater material goods. Just in general, their strength is stronger, not merely by holding it, but by what those cities can provide. And of course, the Chinese don't want that because that means unless they're willing to trade and do whatever along that end, they'll probably mean more raids, more strength, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a lot of forts built around there, specifically some very large forts. I want to say the Indochina Fort, which it's like Jing something something. It's in the book and it's on the map, and I'm not going to look it up. But it's the last fort in China. It's like the last stop. And a lot of people said people that would be leaving would be crying in pain and distress, and people that would be coming in along the Silk Road would be crying in relief, crying in, we've made it this long distance without, you know, even though we're still somewhat isolated because we're on the fringe of China, at least the Chinese have this garrison there, except for the times that the Mongols were able to take it over. But it was a very strong garrison. And the Chinese, over time, reinforced it and reinforced it and reinforced it. And really, there's like three of them kind of along the route that were reinforced to the point where the Chinese really did make this Chinese territory over time. Really, the fight over that was more kind of in the early part, kind of like, I'd say probably like, well, probably 220 BC from when China was unified to like 1,000 or so AD. But once the Ming came into power, their fort building was just so strong that the Mongols could still do raids, but they weren't really able to take over like the very, very strong fortified areas. Anyway, kind of going east, you reach the city of, and I am going to open this up, it is Lingzhou, I believe. Okay, yeah, here we go. Oh, Langzhou, with the, no, it's, well, Langzhou is to the south, but it's essentially the area where it moves from the Silk Road, from the desert mountains into the Ordos, which is a semi-productive kind of clay plateau that exists kind of on the edge of China. It's still able to produce agriculture, so people don't necessarily need to be nomads, but it's a very poor area. It's also an area that has wall on a plateau does not particularly have that many mountains, so it makes it vulnerable to like raids. Specifically, on the south end of the Ordos, once you start getting into more fertile territory along the Wei River, which is a tributary of the Yellow River, you get the city of Xi'an, which is very historically important, was the ancient capital, and it's just, that's true China, but is exposed completely to the north. So what they did is they built the wall across the Ordos. Now this area of the Great Wall has been one of the least well kept up in modern times. Sort of to the west, you can kind of bank on the tourism of the Silk Road and these massive forts that were built by the Ming to revitalize kind of in modern times or whatever. And around Beijing, you have a lot of tourists, so there's a lot of rebuilding that's going on there, as well as just sort of the isolation of some of the other areas of the wall that haven't been rebuilt means that they don't get like pilfered for bricks. The weather is bad, but they tend to hold well because they're more isolated. Whereas along the Ordos, where it's open, time moves on and a lot of the wall has either been knocked down for roads or pilfered for bricks by the local, populace or whatever. So it's just an area that's not super well kept up, but it's kind of interesting because it's more, it takes more gumption to find where the wall is. And John actually, went on some kind of harebrained car rides to find where this was. Now, one area on the western side of the Ordos, near Yinchuan, I believe I got that correct, Yinchuan, is the Z or Wu Studios, where like Raise the Red Lantern and a lot of kind of historical pieces were shot for modern Chinese films, but films that were like historical films. I guess the equivalent would be, it's considered the quote unquote lot of the equivalent of like the Great West, like the saloon and all that stuff. Now, obviously, we're talking, one's for China, one's for America, so we're talking apples and oranges, but it's a similar concept. And so that area is like real cool because it's just been kind of, kept up and everything. And then the main area, I talked about the Ordos, I talked about the Silk Road area, is the kind of mountainous, but not nearly as mountainous as the Himalayan area north of Beijing. Now, obviously, as the capital moved to Beijing, this is the most hotly contested area. This is the area that if the Mongols knew that they could take, that they could get a king's ransom for to get them out. And it was the area also most defended by the Chinese because their emperor was just a mere few hundred miles from the raiding marauders of the north. Now, what's kind of interesting about this area, I think, is kind of the combination of very old forts and areas, or very old areas that are kind of run down. That he specifically mentioned the village of, I believe it's Di Shuangbu, I believe, that essentially there's no tourism there for the wall at all, and it's essentially just a walled city that it still provides its kind of daily function of, this is a very windy area, so the walls are there to essentially protect some of the kind of enclosed village from the elements of, the Great Plains of the Gobi, which, is interesting compared to, say, Badendong, which I believe, I probably said that wrong, but which has no day-to-day purpose. It's just pretty much used for tourism. Kind of some of the other interesting things. I guess this is the area where Genghis Khan broke through. Now, Genghis Khan was very interesting because kind of the predecessor to what would later become the Yuan Empire under Genghis Khan was the Jin Empire, I want to say. And actually, those were another band from the north that took over Beijing. Now, why weren't they as well known? Well, simply because they took over Beijing. This is the Jin, I believe, and kind of had some very loose control for about 20 or 30 years. Maybe it was a little longer than that. I don't have my time frames exactly correct. But and also the Jin were sort of like the nice Mongols. They were the Mongols that were semi-civilized close to the wall, not the ones that were later became Genghis Khan, that were from what is now known as True Mongolia, or well, not True Mongolia, but the nation of Mongolia. You know, kind of not the ones that interact with the Chinese kind of along the wall, but the ones that came from way back and really rushed in. So obviously they're much more dramatic than the Jin. But one of the reasons why China was so vulnerable to this tribes from the north, that while ruthless, were vastly, vastly outnumbered by the military of the Chinese and just the resources of the Chinese, was because the Chinese were split at this time period between the Jin and the north that I mentioned, and what used to be unified China under the Song. The Song still controlled a lot of the south. So the Mongols were able to sort of use this split, kind of this weakness, in order to come in and sweep across the country. Now, eventually, Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan was mostly a Khan. He was not really a Khan being the ruler of the Mongol people. He really was not considered an emperor of China. Now, he was really probably the greatest emperor under the Yuan Empire, which kind of, as the Mongols took over and over, yes, they were very brutal, but they also co-opted some of Chinese civilization into their own customs. So you could call the Yuan Empire a Mongol empire, but I think it's more fair to call it a Chinese empire with Mongol rulers and Mongol influence and kind of Mongols at the top. Probably the greatest of the Yuan emperors was Kublai Khan, who was, I believe, the grandson of Genghis Khan, and I believe it was under Kublai Khan that the Mongol Empire became at its largest, essentially ruling from the Black Sea, kind of the fringes of Europe, Russia, like even getting into like areas like Hungary, ruling large parts of the Middle East, like Iraq, Iran, ruling all of Central Asia, ruling China, ruling parts of northern Southeast Asia, famously not losing in a battle to the Japanese, where their entire fleet sunk, not being able to take India, though their offspring of their offspring of their offspring later became the Mughals, very similar sounding. That's kind of a different story, but eventually ruled India. But because the Mongols were built more for short-term ruling and raiding, their empire only lasted about 250 years before the Ming, the locals, eventually came over. Now, the interesting thing about this was the Ming, you would think that after this giant loss, and the Ming being a truly Chinese dynasty, they'd learn their lessons and wouldn't be vulnerable to the north. Or what they would really do is they'd co-opt the north by trading and not make them all angry, and then having the raids or having the animosity that could potentially lead to another Genghis Khan situation. Well, of course, no, they don't do this. They build the wall more. They become more isolationist, become more jingoistic. And now the Mongols never really were able to coalesce under one banner and take over all of China like they did Genghis Khan. But there was the ENHAI, I believe is his name. And so there were a number of times where Beijing was certainly threatened, where it was just not the best way of going about things for the Chinese. And of course, the Ming Empire eventually did fall to a band from the north. Not from the northwest, the Mongols, but actually a band from the northeast that were kind of a combination of agriculturalists and nomadic peoples, like semi-nomads, called the Manchus, which eventually founded the Qing Empire. Now, the interesting thing about this is, once again, it came during a time of vulnerability. Um, the Ming, under their giant wall building scheme, that really, I'd say the wall would be known, but wouldn't be world famous if it wasn't for the Ming. Because the Ming really, they put so many resources into the wall. They unified it along the entire track, not where it's one wall, but where there's some sort of continuous wall or walls, all the way from the Silk Road to really the Yellow Sea. So it's really them that kind of gave it its grandiose flavor that it has today. Well, of course, this costs tax money, and people that are not on the top of society are not necessarily going to be happy about this, because it puts huge strain on, the number of people that have to come and build the wall for them. And so the Dashing Prince, now there's another name that he has, but the Dashing Prince came from, what did I mention earlier? The Ordos region, an area north of the ancient, he came from an area north of the ancient capital of Xi'an, in kind of a rebellion against the Ming, because the Ming were taxing these people so high to get this wall built. Well, he eventually has all these victories in the west, what is now kind of central China, but the Ordos area, and actually controls a large area of northern China. The South largely just kind of, I don't know, southern China just does their own thing. I mean, they're still one nation, but they're just not important for the wall, basically. So he controls all this territory and eventually raids the Ming. Well, the Ming emperor, as well as anyone that could come into power on the throne, commits suicide. And for a very short time period, I think it was a number of weeks, the Dashing Prince was actually the emperor of China. Well, the side story to this is that there is a general, whose name I don't remember, who kind of went to the northeast. Yeah, the northeast. So the Dashing Prince came in from Beijing this way. This general kind of went to protect against the northern tribes the other way, while the rest of the army fought the Dashing Prince this way. Now, this general had a large army. I don't know why that he wasn't initially sent to oppose the Dashing Prince, but he was essentially sent to fight these northern tribes that really at this point they were threatening, but they weren't like the threat that the Mongols were, for example. Well, maybe they were, but it just not as severe, if you will. It took a series of circumstances for the Manchus to come into power. So he hears his love, I don't know if it's his wife or is just the woman his heart yearns for, is still in Beijing. So he hears about all this turmoil that's going on, and he knows that he alone cannot take his army and re-invade Beijing against the treasonous Dashing Prince. So he actually combines with his old nemesis, the Manchus. Now, the Manchus are similar to the Mongols, but once again, I said like semi-nomadic, more to the northeast. But, they're north of the wall, barbarian tribes. Or at least that's how the Chinese would see it. And they come together and raid Beijing, and he gets, I can't remember if the love of his life was killed. I think she survived, though, and I think that they went off and lived their life happily ever after, I think. But the Dashing Prince is now killed. There's nobody in power because all the Ming are dead. So the Manchus, kind of just by happenstance, come into power as the emperor, or as the rulers of Beijing. And because Beijing is seen, although there's lots of power throughout the rest of China, Beijing is seen as the eternal capital, the forbidden city and all that kind of stuff. The Manchus really come into power and rule for 400 years. 300 or 400 years. Well, what eventually happens is the same old story. The Manchus, or what would now be later known as the Qing, not Qin, that was the first emperor, the Qing Empire, or I believe they pronounced the Qing. It might be like the Qing, depending on pronunciation, but it's spelled Qing. Um, they became enamored with their success and kind of sluggish in their ruling and just do not see that the world, even in the 17 and 1800s, is becoming globalized, specifically through colonialization. Now, China was never really colonialized outside of Hong Kong, but what it was essentially they were giving very, very unfair um, trading laws and trading treaties. Like that's why the Opium War was fought, and so the Qing eventually fall, having nothing to do with the Great Wall of China, but they eventually fall to Western powers. Now, what's interesting about this is, unlike the Ming, who had these great walls built, the Qing essentially let the wall fall into disrepair to the point where when Westerners first started coming to what was that? When Westerners first started coming to China, they were given tours from Beijing up to the Qing summer capital in Chengdu. Well, between those two cities is a gate that goes through the Great Wall. And much to the surprise of the Qing and the Chinese at the time period, the Westerners were actually more enamored by the wall and this great, seemingly unused barrier that existed between those two cities more than anything in Beijing or anything in the emperor in Chengdu. And so it was really kind of the West almost that revitalized, like, say, interest in tourism. Now, I mentioned that they let it fall into disrepair. Well, why is that? Well, it's because the Manchus are the northern tribes. There's no reason to have a border wall when the border wall is essentially useless because you have like a combined nation now. Essentially, the Mongols pledged their allegiance to the Manchus, and now that the Manchus are in power in China, there's no reason for the wall. No one's attacking anybody anymore. Yeah, so that's kind of how the wall comes into modern times. Now, I have talked a lot about, man, this is a really long review, but this is a really good book. I have talked quite a bit about kind of the history of the way it works, but kind of what is very interesting about this book is I'd probably say it's like 60 to 70% history, but then also like 30% of John just going around finding it out. Now, I can't quote every single circumstance that he gets himself into or kind of the beauty that he sees, kind of just the observational side of it. But he does really a good job of not making it too dry. You know, one of the criticisms I have of a lot of history books is it says some interesting things, but it provides no context for just living in the world. You know, it's like, well, the Qing and the Ming, that's all interesting. But like when he's standing on the Qing tombs, or he's standing in the Ming tombs, or he's standing on the Qin tombs in the first emperor of China, you know, where the terracotta warriors are, which he wrote another book about, which I haven't read. It's all very, it all provides some sort of context for, yeah, this is the real world. This is the way it really is. So, yeah, I wish I could go on a little bit more about that, but I've gone on so long about the history. This review's going to get close to 40 minutes. So, The Great Wall of China, I'm just going to wrap it up here. Extraordinary book. The Extraordinary Story of China's Wonder of the World. An extraordinary story, extraordinary book. You know, I think that he's trying to imply by extraordinary story that the story itself is extraordinary, but the book itself, the story, the way that it was told was also extraordinary. Yeah, I'd probably put this in the top 10 books that I've read. I don't know. I hate lists, but it's a very good book. So, The Great Wall of China, The Extraordinary Story of China's Wonder of the World by John Mann. Check it out, you guys, and check out some more of my reviews. All right, bye.